Last week, we saw God the Father holding a scroll with 7 seals, which represented the unfolding of God's judgment and redemption plan. No man was found who was worthy to open the seals and initiate the plan. But then John is informed that Jesus is both the lion and the lamb. Jesus is the lion who has conquered Satan and evil. Because Jesus led a sinless life and went to the cross in our place, he is also the perfect sacrificial lamb. As a result, Jesus was found worthy to open the seals. He takes the scroll from the Father, and this initiates a chorus of praise and worship, which shows that Jesus and God the Father are both on the same level. They're both God. Today we'll be examining chapter 6. In chapter 6, we see Jesus initiating God's judgment and redemption plan for mankind. As we begin today's study, we need to keep in mind that Jesus is the one initiating God's plan. This speaks to the fact that we learn of the fact what we learned earlier in Revelation, that Jesus is sovereign and that nothing happens without his allowing it. He is behind the scene orchestrating events. We will see where God uses evil characters to accomplish his purposes. One other thing we need to be mindful of as we study chapter 6 is the fact that when God uses suffering, some people are drawn to him. On the other hand, some people are repulsed by him. A case in fact is when Jesus hung on the cross, 2 men were crucified with him. Through their suffering, one was drawn to Jesus. He responded by saying, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." The other criminal rejected him. God used the same suffering to purify believers and to punish unbelievers. Let's begin today's study of chapter 6 by reading verses 1 and 2. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and it was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent to conquest. Jesus opens the first seal. By doing so, he initiates God's judgment and redemption plan. This plan is initiated following Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Opening of the first seal reveals a rider on a white horse. He is given a bow and has a crown. The rider's goal is to conquer. His desire is to conquer the whole world and to become its leader. At first glance, we may think that this is speaking of Jesus himself. After all, he is riding a white horse, which throughout the rest of Revelation is a reference to Jesus. But in fact, this is not Jesus. This is an imposter. He clothes himself as a savior, but in reality, he is the Antichrist. He has a crown, which indicates he has authority. And this authority has been given to him by God. Not only does he have authority, but he also has a bow in his hand. He is bent on destruction. He is a satanic force in the world, which seeks to defeat and oppress believers through lies and persecution. 1 Peter 5:8 reminds us, "Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour." When believers encounter persecution or trials, they should have confidence, knowing that God is sovereign and that he has allowed the unleashing of any satanic force that would seek to discourage or destroy us. We need to be reminded that God can use these trials as a way to strengthen our faith. James reminds us, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing your faith produces perseverance. We saw the recurring theme in the 7 layers letters to the churches to persevere. We can be encouraged that these trials do help to strengthen our ability to persevere. In verse 3 and 4, we see Jesus opening the second seal. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. This rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. The second seal is a reference to the unleashing of war. The first horseman strives for world dominance, but the second horseman seeks to divide nations against each other through war. This is just one of Satan's other attempts to conquer believers so that they will become discouraged and lose their faith. This warfare may also refer to a spiritual warfare. In Ephesians 6, we are encouraged to put on the full armor of God to fight against the enemy in this spiritual battle. In verse 12, Paul reminds us, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." In verse 5 and 6, we see Jesus opening the third seal. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in its hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage. Do not damage the oil and the wine. The rider on the black horse is holding a pair of scales. The significance of the scales is that during times of famine, food would be rationed out using scales. This horseman ushers in food shortages. The cost of wheat and barley would each sell for a day's wage. 2 pounds of wheat would feed a family for a day, whereas 6 pounds of barley would last 3 days. The reference to not damaging the oil and wine indicates that the very rich would not be affected. The common man would be spending all of his income on meeting their basic needs to stay alive. Christians will be the first to be affected because, as we will learn later in Revelation, they will be denied access to basic commodities. Again, this is another attempt by Satan to discourage and destroy Christians. When Jesus opened the fourth seal, a pale horse is released. Let's read verses 7 and 8. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind it. They were given power to overthrow the earth, to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beast on the earth. The rider on the pale horse is Death and Hades. Remember that death and Hades are under the authority of Jesus. Let's look back at chapter 1, verse 18 of Revelation, where Jesus tells us, "I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades." In the Greek, the word death can also be translated as plague. So the emphasis here is probably on plagues. Not only is death a result of plagues, as we well know, it is also a result of opening of the previous seals. That is, war and famine also result in death. War, famine, and plagues are events that God has used throughout history to punish the wicked and also to refine believers. Since the time of Jesus' resurrection, even before this has been the case. However, the book of Revelation is primarily focused on the end times. Jesus provides some additional insight into when the end will come. Let's read Matthew 24, verses 3 through 14. As Jesus was sitting on the mountain of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of war, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Much of what Jesus shares as the events that will usher in the end of the age corresponds with the opening of the first 4 seals in the book of Revelation. I do want to bring to your attention one specific thing. In verse 8, it says, all these are the beginning of birth pains. The Chinese use the word dainan, where the English is more specific and uses birth pains. The English is closer to the original Greek. The thing I want to bring to your attention is that when a woman has birth pains, the closer she gets to delivery, the more frequent the pain comes and more intense. That will be the case in the last days. With the events that are happening in our world today, I would surmise that the end is getting nearer. As these events become much more frequent, it's like birth pains. They become more frequent and more intense. As this intensifies, believers need to be prepared for increased persecution. We need to be prepared to persevere as Jesus encouraged us to do in the letters to the 7 churches. And we need to rest in the assurance that God is sovereign and he controls our destiny.